Hello, Dr. Neil.
Hello, Mel. It's nice to see you. So great to be with you today.
Likewise, likewise. So today I thought it would be interesting for us to have a chat about a topic that's really foundational to Chinese medicine and also to like a lot of different cultures that people have different understandings about, which is to do with like the five elements.
That's a great topic.
Right? Because it's something that a lot of people are familiar with. Definitely acupuncturists use it all the time. It's a whole style of acupuncture in Chinese medicine, and it finds its way into different areas. But through my time studying with you, like with many things, you learn, I've learned a different way of looking at and understanding what it means. One that adds, for me, like a lot of richness and a lot of, I don't know, kind of firmness and stability. Like once you understand it, patients really enjoy it. So I thought it would be kind of interesting in order to give people like a little peek or a window into how you approach things and how looking at the original text kind of maybe shifts our understanding a bit to discuss how you might look at the five directions.
Sure, let's do it. It's a fascinating thing. And actually, all the terms are so rich and deep. And if we're honest, there's so many good things in Chinese medicine. And I think we also have to admit that maybe we're not on such firm footing with our understanding of terms. And this leads to this very interesting situation. If I go talk at a conference, for example, I look out and there's people sitting next to each other. And I know they're all hearing what I'm saying in a different way because they have a different understanding of what terms mean, or maybe they don't have an understanding of what terms mean. But when you're sitting in the conference hall, you feel as if you're sharing it with everyone else, like you're all in this bubble of we all know what qi is. I remember I was asked to talk at a conference once about, and it was going to be a panel of luminaries. And we were going to talk about what was the meaning of qi, and like such a basic thing. And I was very excited to be there. And in my mind, I thought, this is great. We're going to talk about what different people wrote about qi or what Chinese doctors said about qi, because there's so much written about all these characters. And when I got there, it was really, I was kind of shocked because we were all sitting up on the stage, and one by one, the people went and said what qi was. And the first person said, qi is the ability of the body to remake itself. And the next person said, qi is actually the autonomic nervous system. And the next person said, qi is love. And it just went on. I was done at the end. And I was like, I didn't even know what to say. And the thing that struck me was no one spoke about anything from classical texts or what ideas were historically. And at the end, when it came to me, I just said, I don't know what to say here. It's so different. And I have to pause and say, this is not a criticism, because my point of view of the world is we're all doing our best with what we know. And Chinese medicine came to the West in a way that we didn't understand it completely. So we didn't know, for example, TCM was actually formed in the 50s, in the 60s. And we didn't have historical context and language context and things like that. So it's not that these people were doing things wrong. They were doing the best they could with what they knew. But can you imagine, for example, sometimes I think about going to a cardiology conference in the 1700s or something before, like Harvey was developing his models of blood flow, and people didn't even know what blood was, or some people thought the liver moved the blood. And so what kind of conversations can you have around that? And so this terminology is really a huge issue for us. And it leads to a lack of, we could do much better in the terms of innovation and bringing our medicine forward.
As
Um,
as a student, with these terms, they're at least for me, they are hard to understand the way they were taught. We were kind of given these ideas, and when I would try to ask questions to clarify, the main message that I would get is that Well, of course, you have those questions with your modern Western mind, so you don't really grasp what they're trying to get at, and you kinda it's like, they're ineffable, like, these words describe things that you can't possibly even wrap your head around, so, you just need to be comfortable with not understanding them, and then maybe once you've been in practice for a few 100 years and you have a long gray beard, then maybe you'll be enlightened enough and close enough to get to them. So I think I got trained, and the people who were teaching me, who I really enjoyed learning from my teachers, but they weren't trained in Chinese or reading the classical text. So I think I was trained to stop wanting to understand them in any sort of concrete way. I was kind of being told that they're unknowable in that way. But then, learning from you and hearing about your work, it sounds like we can get quite a bit closer, really, to understanding
Oh,
those.
it's completely different. And there's a fairy tale that kind of summarizes this, and this sense of like you should know, and don't question. And it's called The Emperor Has No Clothes. The emperor's walking down the street without any clothes on, and everybody says to each other, "Can't you see the fine clothes he's wearing?" And it's the child who says he's not wearing any clothes. Um, and that's kind of a situation we have in Chinese medicine too. It's also like when we have our, people who are skeptical of Chinese medicine. Um, and our response to them often isn't, let's go back to the sources and understand this better and like come up with an argument of why we do things. It's to say that those people just don't get us. They don't understand qi because they don't do qigong in the morning, whatever it is. But the Chinese physician scholars who wrote this, they were looking at the natural world very, very closely. And they came up with very specific technical terms. And we have to say they used them in a way that had meaning to them. And they took the effort to write things down, which was not easy. They were writing it on bamboo strips, and then they had to copy it because the strips would break, and so forth and so forth. So their language is very, very important. And it's important to remember always that there was a time when all of the terms made sense, and they weren't just haphazard. They would use a term like Wu Xing very specifically and another term right next, in the next sentence to say something else. And this is what I sometimes refer to as the technical knowledge of Chinese medicine. What was the actual vision and what were the words? But how can we get there? 2,000 years ago, written in an ancient language, which most Chinese people today can't read. The characters meant something different. People have been writing commentaries about it for centuries and they don't really get it all. So how can we get back there and understand these terms? That's been the work I've been working on for the last 20 years. That all really changed, by the way, as I mentioned before in other talks, when these texts were put on databases, which changed everything because it allowed for a new kind of character research. For example, Wu Xing. Before this, I would go to my teacher and say, what does Wu Xing means? Or maybe I'd read the text and take my pencil and underline where they put it and so forth. Now, if I want to understand Wu Xing, I type Wu Xing into dtext.org or someplace like that. It shows me immediately all the instances in the Neijing, the Nanjing, all early Chinese medical texts, all other philosophical texts, historical texts, poetry texts, etc. And now all of a sudden we can do this reconstruction, and that's been my work.
So for people listening or watching who are either practitioners or members of the public who just enjoy learning different ideas or maybe more principle based understanding of how things work, do you think that the kind of typical, I say typical modern Western person can understand these ideas?
Absolutely, because these ideas all come from looking out your window, at the clouds, at how water flows, at your garden. This is not an esoteric. One of the ideas I had, I think other people have sometimes, is that this is all highly esoteric and is only known by a sage who lives in a cave and eats mushrooms and does, Tai Chi all day. And we can't get that. And nothing could be further from the truth. It's right in front of our eyes. And as I often say, there's not a Chinese medicine world full of qi and yin and yang and a Western world full of like cells and other things. There's one world, and we're both looking at the same world, and we just have different stories about it. We frame our experience through stories, and we want to, if we choose a story, it focuses how we see things. And the stories seem like different worlds, but they're actually looking at the same world. And actually, what I've come to see is the deepest beauty of these early texts is not that they give us a new needling technique, but they give us a new story. So that when I walk out the door in the morning, I see the world through different eyes, and that's everything there. But it's the same thing. And honestly, I always, say, and I'm not the only person who said this before, but if you can't explain it to a child, you don't understand it. So absolutely. And these descriptions, whether you're a healthcare worker or not, completely change your life and the trajectory of your life. What I've come to see over my work, it's about the stories we tell. And if you want to change something about how you live, don't change the details, change the story. And that story is both our superpower. We can change the world by telling a different story. And it's also our downfall because we get stuck in stories. Like right now with climate change, that nature is a resource for us to use and discard. That's a story. And that story drives everything. And we can work on, new technology for electric cars and things. But until the story's changed, we're stuck in that place. And I see really we're at this place in human evolution where we're being asked to evolve into a new way of being. It's not about finding a new electric battery completely. Oh, that's good. It's about evolving into a new way. And that involves getting better at using our stories. So these texts are open for everyone. As a matter of fact, not to wind on here forever, the people who do the best with my material are the people who have no medical background. Because, and I remember very early on, I had a woman who was a stay-at-home mom, and she liked photography and she liked Chinese ideas. She tried for the class, and she was the best. Because for medical people, they're not just learning something; they have to break something down to make space for something new. So everything they're learning, it's like, oh, but I learned this and that, but he says that, and the text says this. Ah. So there's this kind of headache that they get. I remember, like in the beginning, when I didn't know how to teach it so well, students would show up and they'd all be really excited the first couple of weeks, and then they'd all start. This was when it was in person. Then they'd all start showing up with like sunglasses on, like they were having a hangover. Like, I can't take this anymore. It's like breaking down everything I learned.
I know all about that.
But to answer your question, yes, this is for everyone.
Now, this is what I've found too. And you can tell, like, when you describe this to patients or you describe this to other people, because you're tapping into something that maybe somewhere innately they already know, there's almost like a relaxation that happens. And I think also because you're describing a pattern, it has almost like a universal applicability. So I think we've done enough teasing, everyone. So let's talk about it. So the Wu Xing is usually translated as the five elements. So there we're talking about things, right?
Right.
So the five nouns, the five
Right.
objects, and those are, let's see, fire, wood, metal, water, earth, right?
Yes.
And then maybe in Indian cultures they have a slightly different
There's
version of.
different versions of this in many cultures, actually. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard some of the, even like maybe most, if not all, pre-agriculture
Like in
cultures
ancient
have.
Greek, you have the humors, and it's
Yeah.
very similar. Yeah.
Okay. So that's, so for people listening who have no idea, that's what they are. It's these elements that were, I don't know, used to organize things at a certain period of history. And then, Chinese medicine practitioners will have a lot more ideas, that we can each of these elements might correspond to different things. So the wood element might correspond to the color green and to springtime and to a certain barn animal that I learned about for an exam and now no longer remember. So we have these correspondences, but when you are looking through the lens of as like a text archaeologist, where you start off with these ideas, but you are putting the terms in, and you can now search all of these classical texts, and you can see these terms in context. Does that definition or that understanding fit when you see it used in the classical text, like in a sentence?
It does a bit. And just a little history about this. A lot of these ideas were set down in the Warring States period in, 200 to 400, 500 BCE, when a lot of philosophical ideas were springing up. And then they were lost due to military and authoritarian disruption. And then they were reconstructed. So we have this original writings, then we have kind of a loss, then we have a reinvigoration. At the time of the reinvigoration in the Han time, there was this kind of correlative cosmology phase, like when people went kind of nuts with this, where like everything, like a wood animal is this, like you said, a smell is like that, a wood smell is like that, a wood sound is like this, and everything is associated. And sometimes that's called correlative cosmology, something like that. It means we're going to group everything, kind of like in Western astrology when we say, yeah, like you're a Virgo and I'm a Taurus and so forth. It's a way of organizing
I'm
things.
really a Taurus, by the way.
You're what?
I'm really a Taurus, by the
Oh,
way.
me too.
I know.
Stubborn beauty. Rock. And so there is this phase, and that's how we see it in Chinese medicine today. People will come in and they'll smell a certain way, or they have a certain facial complexion, or their voice sounds a certain way, and we say, oh, that's really a wood person or a wood presentation, because we're making these associations. The first thing, of course, is the problem with the word elements. And this is actually a huge thing. Many people in Chinese medicine know that this should actually be translated as motions. Xing means motion. And when you look at classical texts, there's a great degree of detail about how they use language. So there are many characters that mean motion, like zhou means to go to, and rao means to wrap around, and cheng means to ride a horse across. And so it's something you don't see in English translations, but in the original, it's very detailed and rich. So Xing is a very specific character, and originally it meant how soldiers walked, meaning that they were walking in a direction for a goal, and also that they were somehow following the imperial edicts. Like they weren't just walking around for fun, but they were doing it for a reason. It means that's a picture of like a crossroads of, two things, that character. So we have this idea of emotion and of soldiers or something official, and it's moving. This is actually one of the biggest issues in understanding early Chinese thought. And it comes down to this. Modern people in general, we look at things. Early Chinese people looked at patterns. That's really, if you want to sum up the whole difference between the two stories, the two worldviews, we look at things to measure, cut, that's our science, cut things down, measure their parts. I always say, if you want to confuse your doctor, it's real simple. Go into them and complain about something that doesn't have a thing related to it. No blood test finding, no MRI finding. That's how we kind of go blank. We don't know what to do with that, really. In China, early Chinese thinking is exactly the opposite. It says things are created from patterns. And if you want to understand the world, look at the patterns. The things are almost an afterthought. They almost don't matter, except for this one important thing. They tell us about the patterns we can't see. So if a pattern makes a bamboo grove, for example, or a waterfall, we can't see the patterns that made that, but we can see the thing that it made. And then we can reverse engineer the pattern. When we reverse engineer the pattern, we're actually getting into the world, the deeper layers of the universe about how it actually operates. And if you want to make big changes, for example, in diseases like cancer, one way is to work on the thing of it, radiate the tumor, chemotherapy, cut it out, which, by the way, is not always wrong. It can be life-saving. The other way is to look at the pattern that made the thing. And the early Chinese viewpoint is that's where all the money is. That's what's so important. And when we look at Western medicine, for example,
Not where all the money is. No, the money isn't looking at the things. The
good,
accuracy is looking at the patterns.
yeah, it's where the real stuff happens. Yeah. And so if you look at Western medicine and, the trillions of dollars spent on the war of cancer and they just can't get it. One thing is to find a better, chemotherapy, and do it again. Another is to retell the story. And when you retell the story, you see these huge gaps that could be improved. In Western medicine, one of the biggest ones is we have no language about the patterns that make things, actually. We just can tell you about the things once they get there.
If I can interject as well, there's another layer to what you're talking about, which is because an area that I'm really interested in is the development of the nervous system and how we perceive the world, and how there's a really strong relationship between the left hemisphere of the brain and the right hemisphere and how we apprehend the world. And one of the things you're describing is that the world of the things is actually how the left hemisphere sees the world, and the world of patterns is how the right hemisphere sees the world. And there's a lot of people who've written about this, but this is like a larger thread, even down to cultural trends and how society is moving. There's a book by an author called Ian McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary, who talks a lot about the philosophical implications. So I just wanted to add that layer for those who are interested, that this happens, and when you kind of get trained to see things a certain way, then you're seeing them before you even ask a question, and you're unaware of the lens that you're using.
Right. And the thing is, when you start to understand the basic pattern language of the universe, then you see it everywhere because it makes everything. So, and even if you look at the brain itself, it looks an awful lot like the branches of a tree. And you go, wow, what is the similarity here? Well, the similarity is that they're formed on the same patterns. There's a few basic patterns in the body. It looks like this, and a tree, it looks like that. But when you're working at the level of the patterns, then you understand things in a much different way. And so, and also those two worlds, the world of things and the world of motion, they were understood in early China. And you see that in the first chapter of the Tao Te Ching, an early Taoist text, where it says, the world is made of things with names and without names. And the origin of things comes from the world without names, which means the world of patterns. And the world of things, of names, gives you the limits of the world. And if you want to know the limits of things, look at the world of names. If you want to know how it works, look at the patterns. Both worlds are sacred, and both worlds come from the same source. They're just different. So, of course, when, like in neurobiology and so forth, we're going to see the same patterns. And this is huge because it's a universal idea about everything. So if you understand the patterns that make the world, it's applicable to everything.
I personally think of it as an unfair advantage because it makes everything understandable in a certain sense.
Right. And we also want to say that we don't want to be in that cloud again and the emperor has no clothes, and that we understand everything, because this story also, it needs to be pushed on and tested. And, if we say we have new approaches to cancer, we shouldn't just say that. We should get, 1,000 people with cancer and have someone test it and see, is it true or not, and all those things. But so far, just out of the gate, it seems so powerful.
So let's talk a bit about these motions.
Yes.
And let's orient ourselves to what are they? So it sounds like these more like popular common ideas that people have, whether they're practitioners or someone who's interested in feng shui or whatever it is, that if you look at the original text, it's sort of like that, but maybe there's some differences. And I think just even changing the understanding from elements to motions is quite a shift. So what else do you understand about the wuxing?
Right. So, a great question. And as you mentioned there, you made an important statement, and that is when we're talking about the patterns of what makes us and the universe and governs everything, we're talking about patterns of motion. So the universe is all about patterns of motion. And if you want to understand it from the early Chinese point of view or Western point of view, study the patterns of motion. You can study the things, but with a goal to understand the patterns of motion. Think of this, you're laying down on the grass and you look up and you see the cloud moving. And something is guiding that, but it's way more complicated than you could even computer model, why it turns this way or that way. You're seeing the patterns of the universe in cloud form. So you look at that and you can deduce things are moving it. You understand the things that are moving it. You understand everything. One of the this all unfolded over 20 years of text research. So what I say now seems simple, but took a long time to kind of get it out of there. The first thing in reading those texts was, this is all about motion patterns. And if you look at the descriptions of the Neijing or other early Chinese texts, one of the main ideas is that there's a seed motion, that there's different aspects of motion. For example, the cloud is one aspect, the stars is another aspect, how things move through the ground, like seedlings, is another aspect, how things move in your organs is another aspect. But at the heart of the universe is a seed motion. And that seed motion is expansion and relaxation or contraction. It means moving out from a root. It expands, it reaches its maximum, it comes back, it gathers its strength, it comes back out. This seems to be the essential nature of the universe in its deepest core, a tendency to move in expanding and contracting ways. And there's something very special about expansion and contraction as a motion. It seems to be one of the most efficient motions. It's always regenerating its opposite motion. There's many things about that. It could be that the universe is still, when it was formed, but it seemed to start to move, and the way it moved was motion. And the words we have for that seed motion of the universe, do you know what it is, Belle? I bet you know.
I think at this point I do. I've learned from a very smart teacher. So yang is the expansion
Right.
outwards, the inhale, and yin is the reverting motion.
Right. So we have these basic terms, yin and yang, which are another terms that everybody uses, but may not understand so well. And they often get translated as male and female or hot and cold or something.
The sunny side of the mountain and the shady side of the mountain.
Which they are at a certain level, like in the form of the mountain, it is the sunny side and the shady side. That's not what it is, though. It's this tendency to breathe. And so we use that term breath because that really is breathing. So we say the universe has a seed motion of breath, and that everything that we see is an emanation of that breath. And by the way, not to get too esoteric, but I'll just throw that out there. It's not many breaths, it's one breath. So you and I were formed by breath, not different ones, the same. When we talk about the evolving as a species, one of the big questions is, are we in communion or separation? And when you see that we're actually emanations of a breath, it feels a lot different, just to meet someone. Anyway, that's a little esoteric. Let's go back to the seed in the universe. It's breathing, it's moving out. And as it moves in and out, it moves into different shapes and configurations. And some of them are organized and some of them are not. And the other thing is it moves into form. Like you and I are a form. We can see each other. And this is kind of a trick that you have to know, that when we look at forms, we think they're static, the thing-based world, but they're actually patterns of motion that are just slowed down.
I love the definition of that character that you teach. Is it
Oh,
Xiang?
Xing.
Xing, yeah.
Yeah, the character for form, something form-based, it means a pattern of motion that you can appreciate with your senses, touch
That
or
makes a shadow.
it's something that makes a shadow, right? But it's also a pattern of motion. So, for example, you and I are here. We look pretty solid. You can measure us, but in 80 years, we won't be. We're on a trajectory of motion and change. And so, one of the things about seeing the world differently is that you really have to train your eye to stop seeing things and seeing patterns of motion in different levels.
This also seems very consistent with the most up-to-date perspectives from physics.
Exactly. Yeah, you talk to someone talking about the Higgs field or quantum mechanics, and they're like right here. What's the nature of the particle, all that kind of stuff. It's right there. It's right out of the Tao Te Ching. Like, for example, is an orbital field a wave or a thing, and it becomes a thing, by the way, only when you look at it. It's so fascinating. You probably know that experiment of the double slit where they send light through it, and it's like if you measure it, it becomes a thing, and if you don't measure it, it's like a wave. It's just like the Tao Te Ching, the world of names, and that. Yes. And I don't want to get too esoteric because I can. So let's go back to the seed of the universe, and it's breathing. And this changes everything. For example, as a physician, when I examine a patient now, after learning this material, I'm looking at how their tissues breathe. And that's what I'm going to work on to restore their balance. And we're going to say health is when the body's coherence is breathing freely and its rivers are running freely. It's a completely different way of looking at healthcare problems. Anyway, I don't want you rein me in if I go too nerdy or
Well, I just, no, I'm fascinated by it all. I'm appreciating being here. So what then kind of moving from this idea of, okay, we have like a wood person and a wood smell and wood, all this stuff.
right.
So if we move from this way of viewing the world as things and move it more towards motion, then how can we relate differently to these ideas?
Great. So now we know that there's a seed in the heart of the universe that's breathing, and it moves into different spaces. So and into different forms and in and out of form. And then we start to see that the entire Neijing text or other texts like Tao Te Ching, they're really focused at talking about how motion looks in different ways. So, for example, the Neijing, the Inner Classic, which I study, which is the root text of Chinese medicine, when it often looks at 3 different levels in a paragraph. So it'll say a certain idea. In the stars, it looks like this. In nature, it's like a tree. In the body, it looks like this. When you get sick, it looks like that. So there's this basic way that they're talking about basic patterns of motion in different configurations or different expressions. And the trick to doing this medicine and really healing serious illnesses is to see everything that the patient brings, for example, multiple sclerosis, cancer, whatever it is, and translate it into patterns of breath or motion. Because the world where things are turning, that's where the illness is caused from, and that's also where its treatment is located. So if we're over here in the world of things, we're kind of nibbling at the edges. If we're over here, we're actually like, well, why did that happen in the first place? So the book is about how motion looks in different dimensions. So then when we look at the term Wu Xing, what we want to say is, what is the dimension? And what aspect of breath are they talking about? And here we have a good, we already have some clues because of the term Xing, the idea of the soldiers marching. So it's not like Dao, for example, is a term which means how the cloud turns in a free and easy way. Xing is like something of like the ruling aspect of the world, how the army marches and so forth. The other clue we have is on the left side. It says Wu, and Wu means 5. And one of the biggest and most important discoveries of this text research over the last 20 years was the realization that the numbers, which are all through these early texts 10, 9, 10,000, 100, 3, 2, 1, they're a shorthand way of telling you which dimension of motion they're talking about. And that like opened up the whole book. Really, it's like, because most Chinese, do you remember going to Chinese medicine, all the numbers? How did you relate to them? Like,
Oh, honestly, I learned it as well as I could so I could pass the exam, but I don't think I had any sort of deep understanding.
right, and it's crazy. It's like you have 6 organs, but 5 inner organs and 12 watersheds and 10 heavenly stems and 12 earthly branches, and you're just like, what's going on here?
It felt
And
very foreign.
very foreign, and you feel like you should understand it, but you don't. But it's actually very helpful and very technical and very specific. And it means when they give you a number, they're telling you what aspect of this seed breath they're talking about. Wow, that opens up everything. That's like a code book, really. So let's talk about that. So when they're talking about the number 2, what do you think? What dimension? They're talking about the seed breath. It goes out, it comes back. 1, 2, yin, yang. When they're talking about 3 or 9, they have double numbers too, like associate numbers, but let's stick with just the main numbers. So if you have 3, it's when the seed breath's moving, but then it comes into relationship to each other in a certain way. Like the cloud can be moving, but then in some states, like in gravitational orbits and things come into arrangements. And the third thing is the 2 things, and the third thing is their relationship.
Mm.
So imagine I go out tomorrow and fall in love, There's me, there's the other person, and there's the third thing, which is what we hold, which is what keeps us together. Already, you see like how overwhelmingly profound these ideas are. I have a joke: when I get old, I'm going to focus on aging marriage counseling. Just using these ideas to help couples because it's so much fun. But here's the thing: let's say you having a problem with your partner, and you think it's about the didn't take out the trash, didn't text me back. That's the detail-based world. It's not. It's about the quality of the third thing between you. And if you get married or go into a relationship, your job is to hold the third thing together, right? Like it's a plant that you're both nurturing. It's the quality of the third thing that determines your experience in a relationship. So if you both know that and you focus on the health of the third thing, everything goes well. You focus on details. Anyway, that's an aside. So 3 things in relationship. Imagine I'm at a square dance and there's me and my partner. I say, you want to dance? And I hold their hands and they hold my hands, right? Now there's a third thing between us. What's the next step? Which way can we move? I could start walking across the room, but I'd be dragging my partner with me, right? It's not how nature works. If we start to move, we're going to naturally start to turn in a circle. If we start to turn in a circle, the numbers we're going to use are 4 or 5. Why? Because when things start to move in a circle, it has 4 quadrants of motion in a circle. Sometimes we say 4, and sometimes we say 5. It means we include the dot in the middle that everything's turning around. So if you look up at the Milky Way galaxy and you take a look at a NASA picture of it, it's like these people at a folk dance. It's turning around this massive black hole in the center and all those things. It's in a circle. So what number, if we look up at the sky and see the stars turning around the pole star, which number are we going to use to shorthand that? 4 or 5? When we move down into the world, what do we see? We don't see things moving in a circle. We don't see the cloud going around in a circle. We don't see the ocean going around in a circle. We see them opening and closing in relationship to the sun cycles. So when the sun comes, the world wakes up. When it goes away, it closes back down. And that it goes in the motion of a wave. And the wave has 6 aspects. And so we're going to use the numbers 6 or 12. So when we see the numbers 6 or 12 in early Chinese text or the Neijing, it tells us, listen up, we're talking about the natural world, the
Well,
terrestrial.
let's back up because you did something very cool with your finger when
Okay.
you were talking about the 6 aspects. And
Oh, okay,
even
let's see
so,
it.
if
Yeah.
someone's not watching, they didn't see that. And if they are watching, I don't want them to miss how cool that was.
Okay, great. So
So
can you?
what's the first bit? So let's see. Let so we've got you're going up,
Yeah,
then you get to the top,
right.
then you start going down, then you might go below. Like maybe we're talking about something like a sine wave. It's not going to
It,
be exact.
it's represented as a sine wave. Yes,
Yeah.
the sine waves have 6 stations to it. Like
Yes.
it's peak stations on both sides, and it's ascending ones and it's descending
There
ones.
we go. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just want that because any of these little details, they can seem so simple, and yet you can use something like that to organize a lot of things, especially in health.
Right. And here's the so when you see the number 6 or 12, it's like they're telling you about you're in the terrestrial world. It's like the ocean. Go to the ocean and watch the wave. It peaks, it troughs, it moves through something that looks like a wave. Now we're in the terrestrial world. If you look at the stars, we're in the 5-level world. It's turning around a circle. And that the important thing here, and this is where it gets a little complicated to our minds, is that what we experience is not one form of motion, but a composite of all the motions present in this space, 6 and 12 level motions, 5 and 10 level motions, 2 level motions out in the stars. And all those things as a composite create the world we live in. And so that's a little more like heady, but I'll just throw it out there a bit. So what does this tell us? Well, right away, when we say that the 5 elements are wood, metal, fire, water, and soil, and so forth, first thing is we say, well, they're not elements, they're motions. The second thing is they don't actually come from the planet space, they come from the stars. Now, this is a completely new understanding, really. Most people do not get this. And what does this mean? And it's an imperial motion. It comes from something that's organizing things. When we look up at the stars, the language of the Neijing says they turn, the constellations turn, and it was believed they were playing a kind of music that was kind of like a dog whistle sound. We can't hear it. But it's when spring comes, it's because the spring constellations turn and they're playing their music, and the makes the plants come back. That was the early understanding. So there's this very complex, and they even give you the musical notes in the Neijing. It's like beautiful.
So did you say that it was possible that someone had discovered like an ancient instrument that was trying to play those notes?
Oh, we're working on this because resonance plays such a big role in our new model of healthcare. And we're trying to understand, because they'll give us a name for, like, the notes of springtime. J, is the name of the note of springtime. There's actually 10 notes. It's pretty complicated, the music, and it's all written in notation. But they didn't tell us the frequency, so, and that's really important if you're trying to put it into practice. So we're going back to look at early instruments, like the bell sets that come out of our, and say, what was that to a note? It seems it changed, which is a little tricky. That's another research topic. But in the future, I have a good feeling, like in the future, when you go to the doctor, when we're a little more organized, you will go into a sound chamber and they will play a resonance and they will see how the resonance moves in your tissue and they will adjust where it's not moving well. And that will be called medicine, along with all the other things we do, because resonance is so key. Anyway, that's an aside. But by the way, we are only one step away from doing that, and that's the ability to read resonance patterns in real time as we put resonance into the body. So as soon as we have that imaging, we can do that. That's an aside. So anyway, so the music came down from the stars and it vibrated. And the sun's rising and falling and the moon's waxing and waning, and it's making a change in the resonance pattern, like that. And the forms of the world form around it, those resonance patterns, those music. And so what we know now, and this was took a lot of years of research too, and some influence from some other scientists and things, is that what I understand now from the Neijing is that the idea of these forms, these Xing, these things that cast shadows, like our body, what governs their creation, and it is that they form around the music that's in their environment at the time in a way that allows the music to move through them in the easiest way with the greatest efficiency. So in a tree, when we look at the passageways up and down that carry the liquids in the tree, they're forming around the fact that the sun rises and falls, and the fluids follow that. So the passages in the tree follow that and make those passages in the way that makes it easiest for those things. It's just like in our body with the blood vessels, it's the same. So now we have these things: wood, metal, fire. They're things, or motions. They're talking about nature. So why are they using the number 5? If that comes from the stars, specifically the constellations and the music. And what they're talking about when they say Wu Xing is the music of the constellations. And they were seen like ruling imperial houses, like the springtime house was the house of spring, and house of summer, and house of autumn. And they would pass down their governments through the years as they handed them off one after another. And they existed in these places called the Wu Wei, the 5 positions, by the way. They're the houses. They make a music, and the music comes down into the biosphere, through the clouds, into nature, and it organizes how nature grows. So when we look at Wu Xing, that term, we're really talking about this music and how it forms the 4 seasons and the patterns of things in nature. When we talk about why do we say wood, fire, metal, and so forth, because those are the forms the expression in form of the music of the stars. So in the springtime, when the springtime constellation rules, takes its governance, it plays its music, the seasons respond down below, and things in nature begin to form around it. And in that time, things are rising back up from the earth and going back to the sun, to its source. And we see that in the motion of growing plants. That's what they look like. They go from the earth, they go back out. And so we say that motion of the stars in nature, we see it in plants in the springtime. In the summer, everything comes out in the branches, everything opens up, the fruit comes out on the tree. And also an important thing, it starts its backward journey. So it's the completion, it's the termination, and the reversion. And we say that looks like fire. That means if you burn the tree, it turns into fire. The fire goes up and then it gives away its energy. It actually then comes over into the center direction, which is related to the soil of the earth. And then it turns into the metal direction in autumn time. What does that mean? It means that not metal as a thing, but melted metal. And you say, well, why would they use melted metal? And here you have to know historically, what was the big thing that was happening, from the Common Era back 3,000 years in China? Well, there was a few big things. Writing was a big one, language, agriculture was a big thing. And number 3 was metalwork. Metalwork, the Middle Ages determined the wars that happened, the governance, whether it was working with copper, bronze, or iron, and so forth. That was the big deal of the time, that you could find these things and melt them down. And so for us, like melted metal, it's like, why would you pick that? That's a strange thing. We never see that. For them, it was like the big thing. And what does melted metal mean? You take it, you heat it, and it runs down. So in autumn, things are moving down. So when we see the autumn time constellations sending things back down to the roots, we're going to say it's like when we melt metal and it pours. Then it turns into water. Water also pours down. But what's the difference between metal and water? It goes back up. So just like fire, it goes up and it comes down. Water goes down and comes up. So water will flow down a mountain, just like metal, heated metal. But heated metal doesn't rise back up. But water reverts and will go up into the clouds and fall down as rain. So they said that aspect looks like water. And that's where we are with those. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. And that gives, for me, like such, I don't know, richness, I suppose, you know, and really, and it's more dynamic than having these things and having these lists. And another thing that you described before is talking about them in terms of directions, which I also really
Right.
like.
So we've created this new healthcare system called Aging Nature-Based Medicine, and it's all based on these writings. And that the idea that everything, you know, every idea I talk about, by the way, or use in the clinic, it all comes from the very first idea that the universe has a seed motion, and everything is so it's a breath. So everything I'm looking at is some aspect of breath. Now you could talk about inhalation and exhalation, or, you know, fall, autumn, summer, spring, which is a different aspect of how the seasons are breathing. Or you could say wood, fire, metal, earth. That's how nature's forms move around this pattern. But those are very specific to areas. So we use directions. And so we say east. That's the rising aspect of breath. By the way, it is specific also to our world, because out in space, there's no east, north, southwest. But for us, we say east. You're facing the south. That's the natural position, because the sun feeds you. The sun rises on the left. It's in the east, if you're in the upper hemisphere. On the top, we call it the south, the southern aspect. On the right, we call it the west, the autumn time, where the sun is setting. In the north, we call it the nighttime, where things go back to the winter time. So when you're listening to like an aging practitioner, an aging nature-based practitioner talk, they're often saying that's an Eastern presentation. This is in the southern direction, tissue planes. What they mean is how breath is forming in the tissue planes or the organs or the, you know, wherever. And that's the shorthand language to use technically, yeah.
Yeah. And I found, you know, those ideas can also be very accessible, because I think one really big issue in modern times is people not really struggling to know what's true or not. And it's not a question of intelligence. It's really that it's things are very confusing. And if you go online, there's all sorts of conflicting advice and who can you trust and all of these things. But if we can plant our feet on the earth and say, well, the sun rises in the east, and you know that it's not just a fact; it's something you can observe wherever you are, and you can use these as a starting point to orient yourself to what is true right now, and then you can, you know, understand that there's kind of things that you know that are true about that too. You know that the quality of light. There's like a certain light temperature at that time of day, and if you're a photographer, you know that. Or that, you know, there's certain activity that's happening at that time of day, and there's when we get into the southern direction, meaning that it's like noon. Well, we know it's warmer, and you don't have to be a scientist or a practitioner to know that. And so, kind of tying back to these really basic, patterns, really, but they're observable, and you know, and it may sound, I don't know if it sounds so obvious, but that it's not even, you know, worth discussing it. But you can actually start to see that, you know, I think it's a really great way to orienting towards patterns, but also these are really important patterns.
Right. So that's so true. And as I mentioned before, my own perspective is we're at this time in evolution where we're being asked to evolve into something new. And that involves understanding our stories in a different way, using them better. But it also means like understanding these deeper patterns. And it's true, if you try and find answers now, it's a mess. And you even know like this isn't going to be that good. You have this feeling about it. So my idea is I always imagine there's a whiteboard with like all the problems of today, and like we're drawing arrows around trying to fix it, you know. And the idea is like, forget it. Take an eraser, erase the whole board, and start over with things that you know are basic. The sun rises in the east, it sets in the west. You know, a human lifespan follows that, by the way. There's the springtime of your life, the summertime of your life, the autumn of your life, etc. And by the way, you know, modern people think they're the most advanced, most intelligent. When I think of modern people, honestly, the word that comes to my mind often is clueless a little bit, because there's things that, for example, traditional people know very well that we've forgotten. Like, how do you define a traditional culture? There's different ways of doing it. It could be that they're located in a certain region for a long period of time. They have cultural stories. But in other ways, like they actually understand the importance of the world that sustains them, you know, that they know where their food comes from, that the consequences of not getting that right were death, you know. So they were very good at that. And so we're also in this time, we cut off a lot of traditional knowledge in our race to advance, you know, with our new tools. But we've left a lot of traditional knowledge behind. And the important thing is not that we should all everything should go back to traditional ways, but we're at a place now where we can take traditional ways and modern ways and retell our stories. That's why this is called nature-based. It's like start with nature first, and look at your problems that way, and then retell them.
This is cool. I think you mentioned at one point that, you know, in I suppose, well, especially in English, but in a lot of modern cultures, when we think about the future, we're kind of pointed in a certain direction. But in Chinese thinking, it's a different.
So this is really important, and I call it modern time sickness, and where we reverse the time order. What does that mean? If you look at the seed motion of the universe, it arises out of a root of motion, and then it expands out into manifestation, and then those manifestations return. And that, up until the 16th century, before the Industrial Scientific Revolution, everybody was looking towards the past, because the past is where the root is, right? And then we know that things come out, and like we plant roots in a vineyard and the grapes come out, you know. Around the Industrial Scientific Revolution, our tools got so good that we started to see the future as our root. And we disregarded the past, we throw it away. And it's not that what's coming in the future is not good, but it's like we've got ourselves turned around 180 degrees. Because where we come from is the root of breath. And that's in our traditions and our pasts and nature, in the cosmos, and those patterns. It's not in the future. So we're backwards. And we've thrown away a lot of traditional knowledge, which was a very hard one. And we can't afford to lose. So right now, do you know, when patients come into the clinic or are living as a human being, one of the problems is the disruption of rhythms. Because if we're formed around breath, stable breath is what keeps us well. And right now we're in a lot of confused rhythms. So even telling these stories restores rhythms, and that's key to our survival at the moment, I think.
Amazing. Anything else to add about directions or the patterns of the universe, or orienting ourselves to what is true?
I would just say this, you know, it can kind of look like a dismal time at the moment with not much of a future. And there's two things that keep me hopeful. And one is that nature and people are extremely resilient. I've just seen that over and over again as a doctor. They come back from things that you wouldn't think that they would. And the second thing is that the world could be so much better, that we're using so little of our potential. If we see nature as a resource to use and throw out the window as an toxic dump and throw plastic in the ocean, you are functioning at such a low level. The world could be so much better. For example, the story we just told. It's not about things, it's about the stars playing this beautiful music that hums its way into the world, and our bodies form around it. And there's the ruling houses of the stars. If you can see them past Elon Musk's satellites now, they're out there making this music, and it's responding, opening and closing. Think about this: in the body, there are 5 organs, and those 5 organs are built around the music of the stars. Now, you might say that's a little poetic. I can just tell you, like, it works in the clinic too. What I mean by that is there's better ways to move through the world and tell our stories. And we have so much good room to move there. And that's one of the goals of these projects. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experience and the fruits of your scholarship. And I look forward to many more conversations like this.
Me too.